Good afternoon, everybody. I hope that I did this right. And I am going to let a few minutes. I'm going to just introduce myself and say a couple things just to let other people join in. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much and welcome for tuning in. And I wanted to say thank you to the Amherstburg Freedom Museum for hosting me today. This is my first ever Facebook Live, so please bear with me if I get carried away or if, well, I am hoping that the internet works just fine. But one of the things that I do want to address or stress actually is that anyone who's interested in the histories of Black movement north or the Underground Railroad to Canadian destinations, Black communities in Upper Canada, you should go to the Amherstburg Freedom Museum and look at what they have. They have fantastic resources and archival collections, rare books. They have a wealth of information as well as fantastic exhibits and artifacts. And so if you are interested in this sort of histories and learning more, the Amherstburg Freedom Museum is a place that you certainly need to visit. And so I am very excited to discuss with you a few aspects of my work and to tell you about some of the archival records that I have found at the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. And also to share, I'm excited to share a few of the narratives of freedom seekers who crossed the Detroit River to find freedom in southwestern Ontario, the region specifically what is now Essex County, that includes places like Amherstburg, Sandwich, and Windsor. I think I will start now. I will start by offering some information on the historical background on the institution of slavery in Canada, as it existed in Canada, particularly this region of the Detroit River borderlands. I will also share with you, like I said, a few of the narratives that I have pieced together. And as well, I will conclude with telling you about some of the scholars that are doing fantastic work in this topic on Canadian destinations, Black communities in southwestern Ontario. So hopefully you will learn a lot, and like I am learning a lot, so I hope that you all enjoy. So let's begin this conversation. One of the things that I wanted to discuss is on background and numbers. And some of the information many of you may know, especially if you are from this region in Canada, but a lot of it I did not know until I actually started doing this work and this research here. So, but I do hope that you find it interesting. So one of the things is slavery did exist in Canada, and Canada was until the late 1840s part of the larger British Empire, and therefore was under British rule. And the first instance where Canada sought to limit, or it wasn't a complete abolition of slavery, but sought to limit slavery, was in 1793. And that was with the 1793 Act to Limit Slavery. And although this act did not abolish slavery, what it did is that it offers some provisions that specified that any enslaved person who reached Canadian destinations would become free. And like I said, while it didn't abolish slavery, it did prompted this provision, and so people started to seek freedom in Canadian destinations. And so one of the things that I look at is the experiences of these individuals who fled to north, what sorts of freedoms they found. And I know that freedom materialized in many different ways across the Canadian borderlands. And it is important for me to address this and examine the levels of freedom they found, because I'm looking at the levels of freedom individuals who fled south to Mexican destinations, what they found. So it's important to look at them together. So now one thing that I wanted to stress that I also learned is that Canada actually abolished slavery in 1834. And so, but before I go into that, I want to also tell you something that I really enjoy learning, is that law that was passed in 1793 was thanks to that limited slavery, was thanks to a black woman named Chloe Cooley. And so many of you might want to know more about her. You can Google her. And she was a woman who was enslaved in Canada, and her enslaver tried to sell her and remove her and cross her back and forth between the Canadian and the United States borderlands. And she resisted, and because she resisted, this case became quite large and big, and it reached the Canadian authorities, and thanks to her, the law was passed in 1793, and that's something that I wanted to share because I didn't know about it until I started doing this work. But back to the abolition of slavery in Canada. One of the things that I learned is that Canada abolished slavery in 1834, and that is very important to the kind of work that I'm doing, because one of the things that I also learned was that one of the things that I'm learning is I'm tracing the abolition process as it happened in Mexican destinations, so in Mexico. And I learned that in Mexico, slavery was abolished in 1829. And so I find it very consequential that scholars, students, and the public, we often, we have this idea of Canada as the land of freedom, the ultimate safe haven. But we rarely consider spaces like Mexico or Mexican destinations as being spaces of freedom. And this is something that I pay particular attention to because I want to understand why this knowledge about Canadian freedom destinations prevailed, while the knowledge of Mexican freedom destinations experienced an astounding erasure. And so, for instance, Canada, as I mentioned a few moments ago, abolished slavery in 1834, and Mexico abolished slavery in 1829, and that there is a 5-year difference there. So when I am looking at these histories, I consider both of these, and I think that is particularly important that when we learn about abolition, we learn about abolition and slavery together, like as in tandem. So if we learn about abolition and slavery in Mexico, we should understand that it is connected to slavery and abolition in the U.S. and slavery and abolition in Canada. So this topic is connected, and it's an important part of the Black diaspora that links North America. But another aspect that I do want to share with all of you is that pertains to numbers. So one of the questions that I ask myself, or that I ask through my work, is how many people fled north to Canadian destinations versus how many people fled south to Mexican destinations. And what I have been able to find is that the numbers vary. And basically they vary because the very nature of the movement, the freedom seekers, was clandestine. So because it was a clandestine movement, it is almost nearly impossible to give exact numbers of how many people fled, because we don't know, and likely we will never fully know exact numbers. But some scholars do estimate that no less than 30,000 people fled north to Canadian destinations, while other scholars argue that it was more than 100,000 people who fled north to Canadian destinations. And one of the things that I've been doing while doing research here in this region of southwestern Ontario, particularly Essex County, places like Amherstburg and Sandwich and Windsor, is I wanted to find out how many people crossed the Detroit River, crossed this borderland specifically, and made it to places like Essex County. And those numbers I haven't been able to find. I think it's something that needs further research, and the numbers need to be estimated. Even though we might never know the exact numbers, we need estimates. And maybe I will find, and if you do know the answer, please put it on a question or put it below so that I can learn, because I'm still also learning these histories. And for numbers of Mexico, for numbers of the freedom seekers who went south to Mexican destinations, based on the research that I have conducted, I estimate very conservatively. I estimate that no less than 10,000 people fled south to Mexican destinations, and that is based on some of the work that some of the records that I have found. there was this one piece of information that states that, or this record that states that in one decade alone, in the 1850s, there were 5,000 people who fled from the Texas regions to Mexico, and that was in one decade. So likely, based on the other records that I have found and the research that I have done, I estimate that about no less than 10,000 people fled south to Mexican destinations. And so this is something that I'm still researching, but I do believe that it's important that we look at these numbers together, because ultimately it was freedom seekers who fled enslavement. It was Black Americans who fled U.S. slavery seeking freedom, and they went north and south, and really they also went east. They went to the Caribbean. Some actually went to African countries and Europe. So, but for the sake of my project, I am focusing in North America. But certainly, what I have found is that the Detroit River borderlands was this space was a BC border crossing. One of the things that I wanted to share with you as well is the narratives, two narratives of freedom seekers who crossed this borderland, who crossed the Detroit River seeking freedom in Canada. And I wanted to show you specifically these two particular ones to demonstrate what freedom seekers found in Canadian destinations. As many of you may know, many found freedom and everything that came with that, and yet others did not. And so these two narratives that I'm going to share are of freedom seekers who fled the United States after 1834, so after Canada had officially abolished slavery, and they headed to this region and crossed the Detroit River. So the first person that I'm going to talk about is Charlotte. Charlotte was born enslaved in Kentucky in 1820, and very little is known about her experience in enslavement, but we do know that when she was 20 years old, she left the plantation where she was enslaved, and on the Underground Railroad, she made it north. She crossed the Detroit River, and she made it to Amherstburg, which is the location where the Amherstburg Museum is located today. And very little is known about her, but it is assumed that she did find freedom, because by the next spring, on May of 1841, she was married. There's a marriage record. She was married to a man named Valentine, of the last name of Valentine, and likely she did settle in Amherstburg, and she lived there, and I hope that she attained all the things that she sought to attain in this Canadian borderland. Some individuals remained in places like Amherstburg and Sandwich and Windsor, and others actually moved around to other locations. So some went to the Buxton area, others went to the Chatham County area, and I have found individuals who actually made it all the way to Montreal. So I guess the possibilities were endless. And of course, many others returned, crossed the river again after emancipation, and went back to the U.S. But Charlotte, we can consider Charlotte as one of the individuals who found the freedom she was looking for. At least that is what I hope, that she did find freedom and she lived happily, hopefully happily ever after. And so if you do have more information about Charlotte, please let me know. She married a man named by the last name of Valentine, so I'm still researching her story, and hopefully I'll be able to learn more fully about her narrative. The other person that I wanted to talk to you about, or wanted to share, is Nelson Hackett. Nelson's Hackett was, he experienced a very different ordeal. Like Charlotte, Nelson was enslaved in the United States. He was born enslaved in Arkansas, and it is not known when he fled Arkansas, but by 1841 he had crossed the Detroit River and made it to southwestern Ontario, so the area of Essex County. And his enslaver, which is very, very interesting, his enslaver pursued him because he claimed that Nelson was very valuable, And he was claiming that he was worth more than $1,500 and he could not afford to lose him. So he followed him all the way to Canada and trying to retrieve him and take him back. At first, however, the Attorney General of Canada refused to allow the enslaver to take Nelson back. And he said, "You're free as soon as you set foot on Canadian soil. He cannot take you back." And so Nelson thought, I'm free. But what he didn't know is that his enslaver went back to Arkansas and filed criminal charges against Nelson, claiming that Nelson had stolen a horse, food, and clothing, which are items that likely Nelson utilized to survive the Underground Railroad. But the enslaver was claiming that was grand larceny. So he filed charges with those papers claiming that Nelson had this criminal record. He took those papers and went back to Canada to try to force the Canadian government to give him back Nelson, to allow him to take him back to the United States. And so this time, however, before he made it to Canada, the enslaver, he stopped in Michigan and petitioned for the assistance of the governor of Michigan, which at the time which at the time helped him. And with the help of of the governor of Michigan, the enslaver was able to force Canada to release Nelson back to him. And lamentably, Nelson was returned to his enslaver, and he was returned to slavery in Arkansas. It is not known the violence that Nelson may have experienced when he returned to enslavement, but it is a story that I wanted to share because it is important to understand that not everyone who fled north or south to Canadian destinations or Mexican destinations found the freedom they were looking for. And when they did find freedom, they may have found very different levels of freedom. And so that is actually something that is important to understand, and it's something that I'm researching and trying to put into words and what levels of freedom seekers were able to attain or have. And so one of the reasons that I wanted to explain, one of the reasons why this enslaver was able to force Canada or the Canadian government to release Nelson back, or to send a free man already back into slavery, is because Canada and the U.S. had this treaty, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. And this treaty called for the mutual surrender of fugitive criminals. And so it was sort of like a gap in the system that enslavers utilized, and it was very common that they utilized this law to force the Canadian government to return enslaved persons, or free persons that were formerly enslaved that had sought refuge in Canada. And this is very important for the work that I do, because while researching the histories of the abolition process in Mexico, I have come across that the United States very constantly and continuously sought to petition that Mexico agree to a treaty just like that, or to agree to a treaty where they could extradite runaway slaves who had taken refuge in Mexican territory. And it is very interesting to me to learn that in Mexico, these treaties or these treaty requests were never entertained by the Mexican government. And so there was no treaty where enslavers from the U.S. could utilize to have Mexico return formerly enslaved that were already living free in Mexico. And so it's something very important to consider together, that there are these laws and treaties that may have played out differently across both freedom destinations. But certainly we need to be able to understand them and research them and teach them together, because they're part of the same thread. And so this treaty, like I said, many slaveholders utilize this treaty to force Canada to send back individuals. And so learning about this is important. And before I conclude, I do want to say that one of the reasons that I do this work and this research is because I believe that it's necessary that all of us have a better understanding of not only slavery and freedom, but the experiences of Black Americans who fled U.S. enslavement seeking to be free, either north in Canadian destinations or south in Mexican destinations. Their stories certainly connect the Black diaspora in North America, and their stories shape the histories of Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And so one cannot be understood or considered alone. They need to be understood and taught together. So some of the works that I have utilized and that have become very important are works, for instance, Kimberly Simmons. She has a fantastic book that you all should try to get. And we have Dr. Charmaine Nelson. This is another book that I utilize. She does a comparative work on enslavement and geographic empire in Montreal and Jamaica. Of course, we have Taya Miles, The Dawn of Detroit. This is a very an excellent work as well. And we have, this is another work that I have utilized, The Fluid Frontier, Carolyn Smarch-Frost. And also Rosemary Sadler has done wonderful work on Black communities, the Black experience in Canadian destinations, as well as Dr. Irene Moore Davis. She has a book coming up as well that you should all read. And that is part of my presentation or / conversation. And I hope that it was informative. And please, if you have any questions, write them down, I guess, down here. And I know it wasn't a very in-depth conversation, but I hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you. Let's see, I'm going to try to read some of these questions. This is the first time I do Facebook Live, so thank you everybody who joined. I appreciate you. That's true. Adam Aronson says, my research is focused on what happens after emancipation, but I am aware of other researchers of the Underground Railroad era in southwestern Ontario. Kimberly Simmons, yes, this is Kimberly Simmons' work, and I had the pleasure of meeting her. She's amazing, and definitely you need to read her work. So thank you, Adam. Let's see. We will put all the names of these books in the comments, and so that you all can read them or access them. I also have read the work of Natasha Henry, who works on implementing or pushing for curriculum in Canada for Black Canadian history to happen. And that is something that is also needed, not just in Canadian spaces, but in Mexican spaces as well. It's a similarity that I find that even though, Black roots exist and the Black history is rich in places like Mexico, the history is not taught in schools. And so her work has been wonderful to read. And so she is also the president of the Ontario Historical Society. So she does amazing work, and you should read it. Let's see, one of the questions here is, do you think certain factors made for a more successful entrance into Canada, location, acceptance of the community, local law enforcement, and freedom? Well, I don't necessarily think that there were certain factors that made a journey more successful than others, because in many ways, even those individuals who unfortunately, like Nelson Hackett, were sent back into enslavement, his journey was successful. He reached this frontier of freedom, and he wanted to be there, and he was there. And so I cannot say that that was a failed journey, because he reached freedom destinations. Now, the law and the gaps in that treaty that allowed him to move was no fault of his. So his journey was successful, but the system worked against him and returned him. And so the authorities in power took away that success, or not necessarily took away that success, but took away his freedom and liberty. So I do know that, for instance, when I'm considering the Underground Railroad that led people to safe havens, I do find that the Underground Railroad is this very specific network of officers and locations that enable people to head north. When I consider this Underground Railroad and what it means, I have to be very careful to try to apply it to the south, to the movements south that went to Mexican destinations, because the Underground Railroad means something very specific. This network, very clearly sort of defined, with officers and people running it. The people that went south, what I have found has been mostly enslaved persons were doing this movement. If they attained freedom, formerly enslaved free people were helping others to freedom as well across the U.S.-Mexican frontier. And there were certainly white abolitionists who were doing this helping, and also black abolitionists as well, who were helping that. And so in many ways, even though the network itself wasn't as formal as the Underground Railroad that led north, there was this network that led south, but it materialized in very different ways. I hope I answered that question. And one of the things that I do want to say is that I'm still learning this history. So I'm writing right now, I'm writing my dissertation. So hopefully when I finish, you all can read whatever it is. It is certainly, thank you, Dave Clark, when you say it will certainly be interesting to learn how many escapees were returned to enslavement under this treaty. I actually found another person, his name was Archie Lanton. He was returned in 1856. It was the same thing that happened to Nelson Hackett happened to Archie Lanton. Archie Lanton actually made it all the way to Chatham County, which is a little north of Essex County, or I don't know where I am right now, but he made it to Chatham County, and he was also, his enslaver also came and claimed that he was claiming that he had theft charges, that he was a criminal, and the Canadian government had to release him as well to him, or send him back to enslavement. So these things happen, and that's something that I'm researching, and hopefully, because the work that I have done so far is part of a larger project of my dissertation, this certainly potentially could be my second project, because I have found that this is an amazing history that, even though we think, Canada was the land of freedom, we don't need to learn more, but there is so much that we can still learn, that there's so many gaps in this rich and wealth of especially spaces. And based on the findings that I was able to find, or on the records that I was able to find at the Amherstburg Museum, I realized that there's a lot of things that many of us don't know. At least I didn't know a lot of this history. So certainly that's something that I would like to know, how many people were returned to enslavement because of this treaty. And if I find out, I will probably write about it. So hopefully, and if you know about it, if you're a scholar who has written about this, please let me know. I would love to read your work. We will, thank you, Brenda Shand. We will definitely post the books and the list I couldn't find my book for, Rosemary Sadler has several books, so she's also someone who does this fantastic work. Thank you, Dr. Wright. She asked, do you have a sense of how often that treaty was used to retrieve formerly enslaved people? At this moment, I don't. That is something that I'm still working on and researching. Unfortunately, one of the things that I'm really sad about is that this quarantine has prevented me from continuing my research across Essex County and across Canada. But I'm going to continue trying to do this work, and I hope that I find answers at some point when everything resumes back and I'm able to come back and do more research here. Thank you, everybody who joined. Oh, thank you, Monica Dirksen. She says, can you tell us more about the lives of Charlotte and Nelson in Canada? Is there any information known about their descendants? So that is one of the things that I'm working on, finding more about their descendants. And I think that if I continue doing research in archives, not just in Amherstburg, but in Windsor and Chatham and Buxton, I will be able to find more about their lives. And unfortunately, because of what happened in the pandemic, all the archives are closed or have closed. And so that sort of cut short my research. And but I certainly want to learn more about Charlotte's experience and also Nelson's. I have found others like Archie, like I was telling you about Archie. And I do hope that I'm able to recover their histories and present them back, because their experiences are very important, not just for my work, but for a better understanding of slavery and freedom in Canada. Let's see. Forgive me because I'm trying to read all this. Thank you, Chatham Kent, Black Historical Society, Dave Clark, Julia Brown, Adrian Strickland. Do you all have more questions? I think that's, if you have any more questions, please put them down and I will try to comment and answer the questions on there. I appreciate all of you watching here, and I see Tracy Good. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being here.